We cross to Sia Beniza, who is a political economist from Political Economy Southern Africa, and he joins us now via Skype. Sia, thank you so much for joining us. Look, there's a lot to get into, but I think the first place to start would be the numbers coming out of Stats SA today. Not very good. What does this actually say about the growth trajectory, especially going into 2019 for the sector?
Sure. So you'll understand that mining and agriculture were amongst the worst performing sectors in terms of GDP growth in the last quarter and over the last year. And this is mainly due to a contraction in the sector. There were a number of big companies in the mining sector that announced retrenchments and restructuring. And this is mainly due to the high cost of operations in South Africa. And historically, the sector has been using technology, but obviously it becomes more and more expensive the deeper you go. And typical mining has a lifespan, and so countries can't really, depend on it for development for a very long time, beyond 50 years or so, when it becomes too expensive to continue mining. And I think the sector is particularly also struggling with adjusting in terms of its inclusiveness, and as a result of the demands of legislation guiding the sector.
Another challenge obviously facing the mining sector is the action from some of the trade unions, where just last month we saw interdicts coming out from various mining companies trying to stop a massive sympathy strike. And that's a major concern for the industry, the impact that sympathy strikes like the ones that were threatened last month could then have.
Yes. Look, I think the sector is generally struggling with its historical legacy of apartheid. Under apartheid, there was a system of migrant labor which maintained the cost of labor very low. And so coming into the democratic era, the cost of labor increased, and the sector didn't really transform in terms of its health and safety standards, as well as its inclusiveness. And so currently the demands in legislation are being the biggest challenge for the sector. But this is also as a result of the sector itself not being able to transform over the years. And so really here the blame is not necessarily towards labor unions, etc., because they stand for the interests of workers, but also the sector itself has not been able to transform itself into a more democratic era that we are under currently, with the demands that comes with it in terms of the social impact, etc.
Yeah, you see, when you talk about starting to have the industry reflect the look and feel of our democracy, obviously I'm going to then look at the mining charter, the third one now that essentially came into effect at the beginning of this month. Not a lot of talk around how successful this mining charter really is, but perhaps you've seen a few things that are worth noting in the new charter.
So I think the charter has been very difficult to implement, I think mainly because of inability or unwillingness of private sector, but also lack of clarity in terms of the direction of policy. So this battle has really created a deadlock in the sector, but I think the sector also has not been able to transform also to demands of things like, changing demands in environmentalism, but also its general sustainability beyond just focusing on the financial sustainability and operations of mining. And this is also reflected in how the sector operates. And this has created a huge cost now that is lumped up at a time when commodity prices aren't very high, and they're steadily increasing, though improving since the 2014 lows. But these are some of the challenges that are, prohibiting the sector from contributing towards growth as one would like.
Yeah, I'm going to stay with the charter just a little bit, Sia. Speaking to a few analysts on specifically the mining charter as it stands right now, some concern around, the minister's seemingly limitless power to essentially review and revise the obligations that mines really do have to the charter. Is that something that should be a concern?
I think definitely, and as always, investors are looking for policy certainty, and what this means is we don't want the policy to change the willy-nilly prerogative of politicians or individuals in the case of the charter. So this is definitely not the way in which policy should go, but it also reflects some of the dynamic changes. Things change quite rapidly in the sector. For example, in 2014, a slow response on the part of the DTI and government to the steel challenges resulted in a lot of companies shutting down because the steel prices just collapsed immediately. And so the one needs to create a sort of balance here between policy certainty, but also allowing policy to be flexible to the changing, market and economic conditions in the sector, which change quite rapidly within a year as a result of the internationalization of the sector. Global prices of commodities aren't necessarily determined in South Africa, and so the sector is always changing and faced with difficulties to keep up with these economic and other changes.
Yeah. We sit and we talk about mining's contribution to GDP and growth, and to some extent it is very much a very high level discussion. If I'm living in a mining community and I'm listening to this conversation, I'm not too bothered about GDP contributions. I'm interested in how the mine in my area is impacting on my life, right? Now, mines have these social labor plans that essentially are supposed to assist their communities, but we haven't seen those, we haven't seen a lot of compliance there.
Yes, I think this is typically where the breakdown between the sector and its social contracts comes into play. Because mining industry and mining operations have such a detrimental and significant impact on the environment and also the livelihoods of people who live around these mining areas, the sector really needs to be more sensitive to these challenges, and its inability to transform itself or to even meet some of the changing demands has led to this sort of downfall. And without creating the social compact where we are mining in a sustainable way, but also ensuring that we benefit and improve communities around the mines, the mining sector will remain a sort of dark, sector in the South African economy that's considered dirty and considered to be, an undesirable sector, rather than what it used to be and what it could be as a sort of what they call, a sunrise sector in the economy. And so this is precisely one of the key challenges in the sector, that it needs to be able to deal with the challenges of inclusiveness in terms of engaging communities and ensuring mutual benefit, but also ensuring the sustainability of its operations as well as the livelihoods of those who live in the areas close by.
Yeah, well, we hear that, and one wonders if there are enough bodies, perhaps regulatory bodies, that are ensuring that compliance and the commitment to community is actually upheld, right? I mean, you look at the Amadiba Crisis Center, obviously representing the Kolobeni community. Not a lot of that happening in any other communities. In many cases as well, where communities have tried to speak to the Department of Mineral Resources, very little response is speaking up for the communities. Is there enough of a voice that actually protects our communities that are around mines?
Well, I think this is also part of the challenge in that communities can't really uphold what's in their best interest because of other limitations, not just in terms of their own resources and ability to stand up for themselves, but also as a result of the high unemployment, right? So people always will try to trade off, the challenge of creating jobs, but also against the detriment towards the environment and towards local livelihoods. And I think the success in Kolobeni, is something that should be modeled elsewhere. It's quite unique, and the ability, but there still is quite a bit more to come in terms of the Kolobeni and whether or not the ministry will uphold the Constitution Court's decision, and how this develops further as a result of these pressures. As mentioned, communities have to balance their own limited resources in terms of standing up for themselves with the fact that this is foregoing some job opportunities, but at the same time, they're avoiding detrimental impact on the environment and their own livelihoods. But there certainly isn't enough. There's very limited resources that go towards this. There are only a few organizations that are actually, standing up and fighting or helping communities to fight against these challenges, especially when it pits private interests against the interests of communities in terms of livelihoods, because it becomes a very difficult balance to strike.
Well, I am about to let you go, Sia, but let's talk solutions now. If you're speaking to government strategy and we want to see the mining industry come out of the dog box? What is the direction that one should be taking?
Well, I definitely think that there needs to be a bigger role in terms of local government because of their understanding of the local challenges. I think too frequently these conversations mainly involve the national government because it's mainly being controlled at a policy level, and typically one considers the companies to be huge multilateral companies. But there is a need to understand what is happening at the local level, especially at communities that are close by, but also trying to find ways to be more inclusiveness. The challenges that happened at Ekurhuleni with the shootout that happened recently in illegal mining is a case in point of how the sector has these detrimental, impacts not just on the environment but socially, and there is a need to strike sustainable social codes and contracts that can lead to mutual benefit and allow the mining economy to prosper, but also include the improvement of communities and livelihoods for those who live nearby. I think there definitely needs to be a much more closer community focus rather than a sort of national macroeconomic focus as is currently taking place.
Yeah, well, let's leave it there. Sia Beniza, political economist. Share your thoughts with us as well. How do we stimulate growth in the mining sector? And perhaps if you are living in a mining community, you'd like to share your thoughts about whether or not there are opportunities coming out of the mine in your area and if your community is benefiting at all. At Open News SA, and send your WhatsApps to 082 777 0735.